On this podcast, you'll find interviews with high-performing, successful individuals in life sciences. On a weekly basis, we cover their proven methods, principles, strategies, and mindsets to implement new technologies that scale to meet the needs of people in our world.
Welcome to Life Science Success Podcast. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Don. I'm a consultant in life sciences. I help companies manage complexity and increase performance. Before we hop into today's interview, I just wanted to quickly mention my organizational maturity assessment. It's on my webpage. It's currently stored under courses, by the way. So in this quick little video that I added to the podcast here, it's actually shown as if it were on the homepage. It's not anymore. It's been moved back to a section called courses. If you click on that, it's just there for anybody that's looking to scale their organization. And what you get out of it is just some tips in terms of things that you might want to focus on in terms of being able to scale your organization. So feel free to take that organizational maturity assessment. So with that, I just wanted to take a moment to announce our guest today. It's Dr. Scott Wagers. Scott is the CEO of BioSci Consulting, the author of Assembled Chaos, and the host of the Beyond Publications podcast. He's also nicknamed the Consortium Whisperer. So welcome, Scott.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you, Don. It's great to be here, and it's great to spend the time talking to you about complexity, because that's one of the topics I think I try to focus on as well. So
that's great.
Fantastic.
Yeah, wonderful. So could you take a moment to just talk to the listeners about who you are and what it is that you do?
Yeah. So, I started my early career. I went to medical school and residency in pulmonary and critical care medicine, and was very fascinated by research. So I did my early career as an assistant professor at the University of Vermont. But then, about 16, 17 years ago, I moved to Europe for love. My wife is from Belgium, so we moved to Belgium. And for various reasons, I couldn't take the job that I had lined up, being a physician scientist. And so really, I was kind of searching around for things to do, and the opportunity came up to help support some proposals to a large funding program in the EU. And they're largely focused on big collaborative projects. And myself, I wasn't a project manager and didn't even know what a deliverable was. But I said, okay, I'll help you write that proposal. We did a couple, and they didn't get funded. So I was sort of, I don't know if I didn't want to know what I was going to do. But then one of the researchers called me up and said, oh, there's this new program, it's being formed. And I said, well, I don't know if this is what I want to do with my life. And he said, well, it's on asthma, and my previous research was on asthma. And I said, well, who's going to be the coordinator? And he mentioned somebody, his name's Peter Sturck, and he sort of was somewhat of an icon in the field in the research that I did. So I said, well, if it's him, I have to do it. Well, lo and behold, that was successful. I found myself managing a 30 partner organization consortium on severe asthma. It was about 20 million in funding. And that took up all my time. That became what, but then through that, I became really fascinated in the dynamic of working together and bringing people together to think together, to solve problems, to do big projects that really push a field forward, and just that dynamic of the creativity that emerges in these. And so I became very fascinated in that. And since then, I in some way, shape, or form, have helped develop, guide, more than 50 consortium projects over the last 15, 16 years. So that's what I do. That's what I spend my time doing. It's about, managing dialogue and thinking about what's important, what the project should be doing, and how we can really have a big impact.
Mm. Yeah. So, I mean, it's very important, and it's actually interesting to me because so I'm working with one consortium here in Colorado, and it brings to mind just it just seems like such an effort, right? To pull all these minds together to try and get everybody to kind of collaborate where they can, and sort of move something forward as well. So I would imagine that there are opportunities along the way for organizations to leverage your capability to try and help with that.
Exactly. I think what it is, our natural, either it's been research or developing technology, you have your own within your organization, you have your daily activities. And consortia are really about doing things that you cannot do on your own, or even a couple organizations together. And that's a different way of working. And so there's a tendency to kind of fall back into the old silo mentality. And a lot of what we try to do is kind of keep bringing people forward because, yes, the challenge is when you go into a consortium, the complexity is there, right? But it's also the strength because you can tap into the cognitive diversity, which is almost a natural in this, and the diversity in viewpoints from different stakeholders to solve problems and create new ideas in ways that you never expected were possible. And that's where it gets really interesting. But that's sort of the idea. You got to keep putting that energy into making that interaction happen. And that was really the main theme of the book, Assembled Chaos.
And are you seeing a lot of in your work? Are you seeing a lot of consortia that sort of bridge geography as well?
Yes.
You know, I certainly see it, in the U.S. amongst like learning institutions, sort of, gathering together. But just curious about that as well.
Well, I mean, all the consortia here, I mean, let me put it to you this way. We're based in Belgium, and there's very few that we actually, partners we work with in Belgium. It's all over Europe, but also in the US as well. We have consortia with partners in US and Europe, so it clearly bridges geography. It's one of the challenges. It's one of the interesting challenges, though, because when we started this, it just wasn't feasible to meet every 3 months, across all that wide geography. So we said, oh, well, we'll just start off by doing conference calls as a way, to when you're putting the budget to kind of save. And in the end, we met probably as much as anybody else, but we also had these conference calls. So like when COVID hit, that wasn't nothing new to me. Like we've been working with these platforms for 15 years, but that you need that because it's that continual link between as well as the face to face. You need both. And because you can't imagine you're trying to do a complex project, which is not something you're used to, trying to push a field forward. So it's about transformation, it's about change, and you're going to meet every 6 months. Yeah, it's just not going to work, right?
Yeah.
And that's part of the dynamic there. So
Yeah. And then how did you earn the name Consortium Whisperer?
well, it's something we put on there. It's just from all that experience and being there to kind of guide or know or understand and you know work on those dynamics within the consortium. I think one thing, for example, maybe this is where it highlights this. You know, you think, oh, if there's a conflict, we need to avoid it,
Mm.
right? When you're in a consortium project or a dynamic or a meeting, actually, a conflict or tension is an opportunity to move things forward. There's never been a conflict that we've dove into that in the end we didn't come out better. So that's part of it is to be there to kind of manage that conflict, maybe even sometimes provoke it and guide the group through it while avoiding things like making it personal, making it emotional, and really build that mutual understanding. I mean, this is why, behind me, no dialogue, no meeting, because it's the dialogue where you really are giving people the opportunity, you respect everybody's different perspectives and you try to integrate between them. That's really where that creativity emerges. And so that's really what in a way, what a consortium whisperer does, if that is really a profession or a real role.
Well, I mean, I oftentimes, so one of my certifications is in change management. And so oftentimes whenever
Okay.
you go through any level of change, you have this conflict. And then I completely agree with you. It's normally helpful to have somebody that's sort of outside of the conflict that can sort of just work with the team on like, okay, so we understand your perspective. Now let's try and figure out like, what are we going to go do about it? Right. How do we resolve whatever this conflict is? And, I mean, it just sounds to me so critical as well, especially whenever you have, different groups of people coming together for a common, purpose, but they also have different viewpoints, along the way.
Well, and I think it's really important from the standpoint of, I would even say, go as far as to say, there's not a problem in life science and healthcare research and innovation that can't be solved by a consortium project.
Mm,
And and that's, you might say, what do you mean by that? Well, over time, it may take 10 years, but the most difficult and challenging problems, the only way to approach them is by bringing a larger group, diverser group together to solve that, right? I mean, think about the Human Genome Project, right? People said at the time, oh, we'll never be able to sequence the human genome. It required bringing together all kinds of different disciplines. I mean, it was funded or started off by the Department of Energy in the U.S., because they wanted to know about, the effects of radiation on DNA, and you stop and you think about the impact that had. But yet it took, it took itself like 5, 6 years. And if you think about it, it's been 33 years since it ended. It's taken that long for it to really start to hit home. And so yes, there's a problem of, how can we, understand DNA and the genetic and genomics? Well, that project solved it. It was a multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary project. So I think that sometimes people don't appreciate that and underutilize. Now, all projects don't take that long, and a lot of them can have an impact much, much quicker. And that's why it's really important to think about it in this way.
absolutely. So let's talk about your book, Assembled Chaos. You released a book during the pandemic. So what was that like for you?
Yeah, well, I think that the pandemic is an interesting thing because it seems like it was it all happened in a very short time period because it seemed like everything was the same. I was writing it, as working on it for what, a year and a half, and then, oh, okay, the pandemic is here. This is when I was planning to release it. I guess in some ways it made it easier because it just had more time, I guess, because to sit and write it. But at the same time, it was, you know, should I do that? Because yeah, everybody sort of has, everything's disrupted. But we went ahead and did it anyway because the idea of the book, it's self-published. It was more about getting all my thoughts and ideas down, something that people could point to. The goal wasn't to make a bestseller, or it was more get the ideas out here, get it down on paper, and have people understand it. So it really wasn't that bad because you can self-publish and all that kind of stuff. So yeah.
And can you tell us a little bit more about what it's about?
Yeah, it's about the what we say is highly interactive consortium. It's kind of the things I alluded to earlier. You could have a consortium that basically ends up being a bunch of people working in silos. So there are certain principles to apply when you're working in a consortium, such as engage stakeholders, work in an iterative fashion. So it's like any complex project, you break it down in iterative steps. But an iterative step, a prototype, for example, makes it very clear to people what you're trying to do. And often, being in change management, you probably understand this. Half the problem is communication. And you say, we need to do X, and they don't understand it. So sometimes there's the book there. When you put it down, you have that. But also, it is this idea of collective intelligence, leveraging that, what I call in the book, emergent creativity, that dynamic, that dialogue between the groups. Things like that are important to make these consortia work and deliver as best as they can.
Mm,
And the idea, assembled chaos, because it is chaotic, but it's also assembled, and you need to be that sort of balance. Because if you made it all simple and straightforward, it wouldn't be addressing a complex project. It wouldn't be doing the things you need to do. But there's real power in bringing that all together. And what I say, it's sort of an exponential. It leads you to making it exponential, because when you get in these consortium projects, you start off, the concept is there, but it says, oh, this is going to be great. In 2 years, we're going to solve all this. And then when you get in about a year in, you go, oh, maybe we'll get something good out of this, but there's so much complexity, so much challenges. But if you continue to invest in that, what happens is over time, things build up, the relationships build up, and you can really start to have an exponential impact. And that's really what we're trying to change with that. So that's sort of some of the ideas behind it. The book is written, I basically brought in concepts from, not only just, well, mostly, the business world and the psychology and productivity world books I was reading, and applied it to what we were doing in the consortium projects in life science, research and innovation. And it's actually a pretty quick and easy read. It's intended to be that way. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, I wanted to bring up the picture of the cover for anybody that's watching us online. It's on the screen, and for anybody that's listening to the podcast later, you can certainly go to the show notes, and we'll have a link there as well. So, yeah,
Right.
very
Yeah.
good. So, with BioSci Consulting, who do you mainly focus on, and how do they come to you? How do clients come to you?
Yeah. Well, I would say, we mainly focus on, maybe in a broad general sense, it's people who are interested in life science research and innovation, like moving it forward. So that includes academics, it includes disease foundations, it includes small companies, and it also includes large companies, big pharma. Because the ideal consortium project kind of includes bits or pieces of all of those. I guess you could also put other stakeholders like regulators in there as well. But generally, people, hear about us, know about us. We've been in these projects, so we've worked with them in these projects. That's one great way to bring it. It's also some of the content I put out on LinkedIn and the book, for example. And basically, it comes down to somebody sees an opportunity for a grant, or has to think about redoing their strategy for their organization, and they come to us and say, yeah, we want to do this, we want to do it with multiple stakeholders. That's a big challenge. This is what we do. This is what, I guess that's another way of saying what I do as Consortium Whisperer is bring the different stakeholder perspectives together, and help to make that to, be creative, design projects and solve problems. So
One of the things that I've seen you mention as well is the translational gap. Can we talk about that? Sort of what is it, and why is it important?
yeah, exactly. I mean, I can extend a bit by saying what we do. If I were to put it in nice sort of pithy terms, I would say we help people develop consortium projects to speed up the realization of the future of medicine.
Mm,
So, as I alluded to earlier, right? For example, in 1995, I started my internal medicine residency in the University of Vermont. There was a company there in Burlington, Vermont, who was working on AI in medicine. Here we are, 27 years later,
right.
we're just talking about, are we going to bring AI into medicine? And like I mentioned to you earlier, the Human Genome Project, that was 33 years ago that ended. And I just saw a paper a few months ago that said heralding the use of genomics in breast cancer. Here's breast cancer, one of the biggest, things. And that's the translational gap. If you look at it in the literature, there's at least a couple papers. Now, of course, it's sort of just judging by what, when things were found and when they actually came into the clinical practice. But the two papers came to the conclusion about 17 years it takes to go from a research finding to clinical implementation. Well, that is a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a valley of death for ideas and technology, but it's also a valley of death for patients. So, and it goes across the entire innovation value chain, because you can think about it for research, new technology, but even when things are approved and coming on the market, particularly now that we're getting increasingly complex and expensive therapies, there's often a process that comes on once it's on the market. And if that process isn't optimized, like for example, CAR T therapy comes to mind, there are people on the waiting list that are dying because it's just taking too long. And so the consortium projects can help, collectively think of how to solve those problems, how to make that process faster, how to better identify the right patients, how to, get everybody to understand what the new technology or new therapies are, how to make it more patient-centered. So that's why the translational gap is what we focus on. It's basically that delay, that's keeping us from reaching the full potential of the future of medicine is what I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's I mean, it's something that I frequently see come up in a lot of these episodes as well, is just the sort of the length of time and sort of the slow pace that, that we move at. And in some cases it's purposeful. And there's a real need
Yeah.
for, taking a real concerted effort to make sure that we get things right. However, like you're saying, I mean, available technology, being available, is something that, getting the greater use out of it sooner would be, something that would be tremendous as well.
Well, one thing it's sort of a indicator is I noticed that when you look at particularly academic researchers, very successful academic researchers, there's a certain point where they've published a lot, they've got lots of funding, they sort of suddenly realize, but that's not really the impact that I intended to have, and then they become very interested in doing things beyond just publications, right?
Right.
Doing things like, well, okay, we need to have a better way of classifying this disease, or we need to have a common model that we're all working on,
Mm-hmm.
or we need to have the big definitive study that pushes this forward. And that's because they really are motivated by really making a change. And that's kind of what that's getting at. There's all these bottlenecks that are there. Some of them are, like you said, important and there for a reason. Other ones are just a resistance to change or not adopting, so there's a lot of opportunity to speed that up, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, and to go back to the AI example, right? I mean, if I were to think about sort of those early AI models that I've seen, more or less, really focused in on decisioning, sort of
Yeah.
basic decisioning and machine learning and those sort of things. Now there are, very complex, thought models that sort of, take an inference and other things to try and, really figure out what exactly did you mean by the question that you're asking of AI as well. And, just the advances that are coming along. And I could see the need for collective minds to be together to bring these things about.
Well, but I also think that AI enables that. If
Hmm.
it has the potential to free us in the future to work together. Because
Yes.
I think if I were to get into it, I would really think that the human mind is optimized for something, right? It's been optimized over what, millions of years or hundreds of thousands of years, whatever. It's been optimized. And so I think AI can free us to focus on what it's really optimized for. And that sort of creativity, pattern recognition, working, and then free us to work together better. Because that in a way it's not an AI, but the collective thinking of a bunch of different people is a very, very powerful computer in its own right. And the other, maybe a little bit of a divergence, but if you look at the patterns, and this happens in consortia, but also in community and ecosystems, the best pattern to set it up, a network, is not everybody working together. It's clusters working on ideas and then connecting. So you have connectors that connect it all together. And that actually goes back even in the anthropology literature. When you look at hunter-gatherer societies, the ones that are organized like that, compared to the ones that are everybody kind of is together, make cultural transformations faster. Because somebody has a new idea, they're able to incubate that idea on their own, and then they're able to spread it around the network.
Mm.
And that's sort of in a way, a human computer, if you will.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I agree.
so I would put my bets, in the future, maybe it'll be the humans against the AI. And I think the collective intelligence of the humans, I would put my bets on that over the AI. So,
Yeah.
of course, the AI could be collective as well. We probably would learn that that's how you do it. But anyway, that's kind of some of the thoughts I would have on that.
Yeah, I constantly, I mean, I, I, the way I'm thinking about like the near term impacts of AI could be extremely beneficial, overall, especially if we take the time to really understand why was the decision made that, that essentially we arrived at. So this idea of, really understanding what's in the AI and how did it make the decisions that it made versus just letting it randomly make decisions and accepting that. So I think,
Yeah.
which kind of goes back to something I said, I think 3 or 4 podcasts ago, which was somebody had brought up, using AI to write. And, I said, right now you could take a very sort of challenging topic to write an email about, just a simple email that's got to go out, and you could put it in Chat GPT and it'll kick back an answer for you. But the one thing that you sort of have to be careful of is what on the receiving end, what will the person, sort of, read
Yeah.
into your message, and does it say the right thing? And if you just sort of copy and paste, which seems to me like the most random thing, but that's kind of how people talk about AI, is like, you're just going to take the answer and stick it right in something. It just seems to me like the totally wrong answer.
No, and the thing I've seen recently is saying it's like an intern or a good research assistant. You would
Mm.
never just blindly trust that. You would, have them kind of reduce the complexity for you a bit, but then the expert still has to read it and say, okay, no, no, that's not exactly right, or, then go a bit further in that discussion. But getting back to your point about understandable I think that's another important point that we need to handle is getting the different stakeholders in the life sciences to be able to understand how the AIs are making decision, be willing to actually learn that aspect of it as well. And that's a multi-stakeholder problem because it means actually going across disciplines as well. Because there's going to be data and statistics, there's going to be genetics, all this stuff feeding into that. I think that's a really, really hard challenge because right now, I mean, some of these projects, we have these great, here's this great way of characterizing disease, looking at transcriptomics and combining it all together. But the people in the clinic go, well, I don't understand this. I'm never going to use it, right? And yet the people who are doing the research say, this is huge. We can actually potentially know who's going to respond to what treatment, how powerful that will be. So this is the bottleneck we have to face. So understandable AI is sort of at the interface of that. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and again, there's always it's going to be this human computer synergy, I think, almost always. So
So you have a podcast of your own, Beyond Publications. What is the podcast about? Who do you normally talk to?
yeah, so beyond publications is it's sort of like I mentioned earlier. You know, I kind of think publications are great, but it's a false peak because people say, oh, I just get the publication, then you know I'm that's it. And the reality is to push it through that translational gap, we need people who are going the extra mile, doing the extra step to bring things, into the clinic. So, the innovation is actually realizing, the research results. It's and so that's what it's about. It's about interviewing different types of leaders in the field, understanding, what their own performance secrets are, what they do, how they think about, and how they've achieved what they achieved, and how they're going beyond publications to make things happen. So, it ranges from, one of the very first podcasts was he was at one point, Peter Barnes was number 7 scientist in the world. That's across disciplines by ironically, his publication metrics, his H index. But yet, when you listen to him, he's very much a solid, concrete project manager, and he actually, was part of bringing, biologics into asthma, which is a way of treatment. So, he clearly, understood the importance of going beyond publications. We recently talked to Nathan Price, who was part of the Institute of Systems Biology, and is now the chief scientific officer of Thorne Biotech, and that's really pushing, this um, treating and wellness, scientific wellness. So, and he recently wrote a book as well. So, to people who are running disease foundations, to people working in pharma, and so on and so forth. So, that's the range of guests. And the idea is that, because in my mind, we need leadership to do this, to go beyond publications and to narrow the translational gap. But leadership isn't just at the very top level. In a consortium, it's across the whole. Everybody needs to exhibit that leadership. down to the PhD student who says, well, we need to write that outline or that SOP. Well, I'll go do that because it's going to be important to changing and moving this whole field forward. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And how long have you been putting out episodes? How long's it been around?
it's only been, I think it's just been about a year, um, or less actually. So it's a relatively new podcast. Um, and we're, probably going to, shift a bit to focus more on some of the existing consortium projects in the future, because I think that that's really gets interesting, and that's obviously consortium projects by very nature are going beyond publications. So um, that's where we're going with it. So
Very good. Well, Scott, there are 3 questions that I like to ask every guest. What inspires you?
okay, well, what inspires me is patience. One of the things we get to do in a consortium project, and I'm a really big advocate, is patients coming and telling their story and what their life is like, why it's important to do. And that's always, always very highly motivational in these consortium projects. And so that it's the patients that inspire me.
Very good. What concerns you?
Well, like we talked about, the fact that it takes so long to
Yeah.
get technology and things across the line, and that we could end up having extreme redundancy and be very slow in changing and realizing the future of medicine.
Very good. And what excites you?
What excites me is that dynamic
Mm.
that you can get when people are thinking together and working together, and people have a dialogue and balancing things off of each other. That excites me, and that is well. If I can tell a story, it's in the book as well.
Sure.
But when I first came and I ended up not being able to take the job I had wanted and started working on consortium projects, I was sort of, what am I doing here, right? This is, sometimes it seemed that, I was doing research and seeing patients, and then I went and saw a lecture from John Cleese, and I thought, oh, this is going to be funny, but John Cleese also talks about business. This happened to be on creativity, and he was talking about more individual creativity, like you sleep on it, you wake up, you have the idea, things like this. And I said, and I raised my hand and got the first question, and I said, but Monty Python, that was a troupe of people, that was a whole group, how did that work? And he said, oh, that was very interesting, because when we first started, we just all got together and it did not work,
Mm.
because everybody had their own idea and they were all fighting for their own idea, and we went nowhere. And he said, well, what we found that worked, went away in groups of two, came up with ideas, brought it to the group, and then the group was actually just modifying the already formed ideas. So that inspired me that, okay, there is a way to drive that creativity in a group, and that's what really excites me, is when I see that new ideas or things emerging in that dynamic. That's what I get excited about.
It's so interesting to hear that dynamic as well. I mean, because in many projects, you often would take, the idea of one or the loudest idea, and then sort of, work with the team to put that idea maybe in place. But it sounds to me like they started with a small collective and then tried to bring that back to the larger collective to get them to work together.
Yeah, and what he said, and I see this all the time, is that that's when you got the real crazy, wacky stories, because the outline would be there, and then somebody goes, it's a chandelier, and then somebody goes, no, 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 it's not a chandelier, it's a moose,
Mm,
and, so then and that additive, so there's this balance between getting everybody's ideas, but then saying, build on the other's ideas, and that's the principles of a dialogue as well, is that you are building on others' ideas, you know. And another thing about dialogue is improv. Improv is a great example of dialogue.
hmm
And one of the rules of improv is yes and. So they should always be yes and, not but or no, yes and. Because that means you're accepting what the previous person said and you're building on it. And that's the principle. And when you start to do that, then you get the chandelier that's a moose, as opposed to a regular chandelier.
Or the machine that goes bing.
Yeah,
It's a
exactly,
Monty Python
exactly,
reference. So,
exactly.
um,
I'm sure yeah.
right. So Dr. Scott Wagers, thank you so much for being on the Life Science Success Podcast. I greatly appreciate you being here.
Oh, it was great. And thank you for having this great conversation. And I really liked, digging into AI and all those different topics. So thank you, Don.
Absolutely. And where can people find your book?
They can find it on our website. It's BioSci, BISCI, consulting.com.
Okay.
You can also go to my profile on LinkedIn, where you can find, I post fairly regularly, and you can go from there.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here, and thanks a lot for the conversation. I appreciate it. Have a good day.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to Life Science Success. For complete details about this podcast, including show notes, how to get in touch with guests, and more episodes, please visit www.lifesciencesuccess.com. If there's someone you'd like for us to invite to the show as a guest, please let me know by sending me a message at the podcast website. Please click subscribe on your favorite podcast app, share the podcast, or tell a friend about it, and last but not least, rate the podcast. Thank you again.